Coming soon to audiobookey.com. audiobookey.com. Real stories by real people. Meet a man we shall call Rich. Rich is a rich man who doesn't want his identity revealed, but wants to tell you a story about his life. In his book entitled Good Guys Always Finish First, a story about going from nothing to everything. You see, Rich was a dorky kid. No one liked him. He wasn't a ladies' man. But Rich quickly learned that in the game of life, it is given to the one who owns the gold, and lots of it. Not just money, but internal riches as well. Rich today is not only rich, but has gotten completely over being bullied, cheated on, and shunned by just about everyone, and is ready to share with you his story of overcoming life and living it to its fullest extent. Good guys always finish first. Coming soon to audiobookey.com. Real stories by real people. And now for your featured presentation. The following narration is a depiction of the life, experience, and thoughts of the author, and not necessarily the voice of the author itself. This story is rated mature. Listening discretion is advised. audiobookey.com presents Lost and Found, written by Garner Trafton. Chapter 1, The Beginning. I was born in France, May 27th, 1955. I was born into a military family. Early on in my childhood, we moved to the States, and we were stationed at a place called Fort Eustis, Virginia, military base. And there, from there, I think we started a life in Hampton, Virginia. My dad was from Camden, North Carolina, just outside of Elizabeth City, and my mother was from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But early on in my childhood, I remember going to school in Hampton, Virginia, in a place called Aberdeen. Aberdeen is located in Hampton. Pretty much a neighborhood in a sense. In Aberdeen, I went through quite a few things. Saw a lot of segregation, a lot of hurt, experienced a lot of beatings, experienced my mother getting beat. But in school, I went to a school, Jefferson Davis, as a matter of fact, junior high school. And that's kind of where I first saw a lot of segregation. And got into quite a bit of trouble. And as a kid, growing up in a household where it was, where most people would call it broken, being confused, not really understanding what love is or the true definition of discipline, being beat a lot, Obviously, it led to quite a bit of trouble for me as a kid, whether I started it or not, because the school that I went into, it was very racial. It was a racist place. So whether I started the trouble or not, I got into quite a bit of trouble. And I never will forget that my father would come to the school and he would beat me in the yards. He wouldn't take me to the side, but he would beat me where everyone saw it. I remember people snickering, even teachers watching on, kinda in their own glee. Maybe just seeing another black kid getting beat by his parents, or black parents whooping another black child. Maybe that was the deal, but I remember those days. You know, the neighborhood I grew up in was very rough. Very, very rough. Very tough place. My father, though, he not only beat me, but he beat my mother all the time. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine getting beat in school and coming home, you get beat, then you see your own mother get beat? Not by a belt. I'm talking about getting beat. This was really hard for me. Maybe it was the military background. I'm not exactly sure, but I remember that when we were overseas, race really wasn't a big issue. I didn't really see a lot of racism until we moved to the States. I went to an elementary school overseas, and like I said, that just don't remember a lot of racial issues. But when I came to the States and I went to Jefferson Davis, I entered into a segregated schools, but the teachers, they were very prejudiced. Anything we did was wrong. So whatever happened at the school, my father would get a call and he would come out to the campus. And you know, my father being a very military guy, he would come out to the school and I would get beat right there in front of everyone. In front of the teachers, in front of the students. And what was sad is that whatever the teacher said I did, I would get beat for it. And it didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter if it was right or wrong. It didn't matter if I did it or not. The teachers would call, my father would come, and I would get beat in front of everyone. From where we live, it was about 15 miles from Fort Eustis, the place in which we lived, and at least the place I went to school in Aberdeen, Hampton, Virginia. But I just remember he would come into the courtyards. He'd make me apologize for what I did, and then he would beat me in front of everyone. And I was apologizing sometimes for things I didn't even do. And I'm not exactly sure, as a kid, how do you process that? I just remember that it was a very rough time. The principal would say whatever, and he could just, I don't know. It was as if he trusted everything that they said, and whatever they said, I would get the beating. I really didn't understand what was going on. I just didn't understand the beatings. But it wasn't just at school. A lot of things were going on at home. A lot of accusations. A a lot of accusations of different things were being made about me. And I'm talking about a lot of different, very foul accusations about me and my mother. But I was dealing with my father, who was definitely a military and discipline type corrections guy, and who never was there. He wasn't there as a father. And I would only assume that his military background, having went through multiple war tours, and experiencing a lot of the things that he experienced, made him a very hurtful, bitter guy. All in all, he wasn't the only one that was hurting. He hurt his family. He hurt his family deeply. He hurt me deeply. It was all tied up into where he was able to act out, I guess. Maybe this was an outlet for him. Because, you know, when he left the house, I became really close with my mother. But he never stopped accusing us of things. Very perverted things. It was very much a very controlled house. He controlled us through beatings. I believe that this mentality came through his experience as a black man in a segregated world. You know, like I said, the military, living through segregation. You know, a black man had to suffer quite a bit in those days. And sometimes a lot of black men killed themselves. A lot of black men were ready to die, and oftentimes they would take their frustrations of life out on the very people in which they, at least we thought, they should love. You know, he grew up in the South, though. There was a lot of correction. There was a lot of racism. You know, years of what he suffered through, I guess, kind of being taken out on us. He going 3 and 4 tours into the Vietnam War. Had to be hard. But there was another war. There was a war that I was experiencing. There was a war my mother experienced, and it was hurtful. You know, and I can only imagine what he went through being in the Vietnam War, because he was a paranoid guy. He didn't trust anyone. But the accusations that he made about my mother and our children, they were perverted. Perverted accusations. And I would get beat for them. He would make me say something that was so perverted. He'd make me say it. It was crazy. So there was just a lot of beatings, a lot of accusations, a lot of perversion, a lot of perverted accusations. You know, and when he was in Vietnam, and he later went on to Korea, and the GIs would have other women over there. There were all type of perversion, all type of perverted things going on with women and children that he was introduced to overseas. When he came home, he was totally changed. He never was himself. War is never a good thing. It might have profited someone, or it might have created, I guess, a level of peace for somebody, but the benefits of war are never good, because it's passed down to children and their children, women, and I was just one of the ones who suffered through it. But it was just messed up. As a matter of fact, to be honest, I hated him. I hated him. I hated him until I was about 16 years old, when I found out he was dead. Found out he was dead in North Carolina. And at that time, I was living with my mother in Hampton because he had left her. I just tied it all to the war and to the things he had experienced dealing with people. It was just so perverted that I pretty much believed that the 3 tours he did, it caused all the hurt and the pain. But I kind of even believed that he had another family, because he went to multiple tours, and I don't know if he had to, but for some reason I believe he had another family overseas. And maybe he didn't care much about the family he had here in the States. He was tied to a yobo, a woman that lived with the GIs and took care of him while he was overseas. While the GIs were out doing maneuvers, the yobos would come over and do, well, you know, different things. It was just their way of life. When he came home, we suffered. We got the beatings. And ultimately, he eventually ran away from my mother. And after he ran her away from the house, he would threaten her life. And just to be correct, he ran my mother away. Let me make that clear. And even though he beat her, he also threatened her. It was just a horrible thing to experience as a kid, because I remember it like it was just yesterday. I was left in the house with my other brothers and sisters, and every night, it was a nightly basis, we were beat. And he was trying to make us confess to having sexual relations with our own mother. Nightly. He would accuse us of having sex with our own mother and would beat us for it. He would choke me and do all sorts of things. At the age of 11 to about 13, the violence had gotten so bad until I ran away from home. I went to my mother's, I got some change, I caught a bus to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where my aunt was. And I thought I was escaping something, and the only thing I ended up running into was more problems. And in Pennsylvania is where I experienced gang life. Chapter 2, Wrong Place, Wrong Time, Gangs and Pain. While in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh as a matter of fact, When I left home, I went to Pennsylvania. This is where I was introduced to gangs, gang lifestyle. And, I wasn't really that involved, but I just hung around. They became my associates. I became a street guy. I guess I was kind of trying to escape something. And the streets kind of had an open arm for me. And I really didn't want to get involved. But I was just trying to get away from my father and the beatings, and I'd much rather be on the streets than to get beat and choked every day, every night. Get told that I was having sex with my own mother. I'd much rather be on the streets. Well, while I was living with my aunt, I started to hang out with a gang. It was called the Stitch Gang. And I remember attending high school there. I remember one time I attended a high school dance where there was this guy. He was dancing, with this young lady, and he began to argue with another man who was also a part of the Stitch Gang. And during the course of this argument, the guy who was part of the gang had pulled out a gun and shot the young man. Point blank shot him. And I think I'd been about maybe 50 feet away. Pow! Shot him and killed him. It was pretty bad. It was crazy. Everyone scattered. And it scared the living daylights out of me. Because I didn't want to die in the streets. I didn't want to die in a gang. And who knows who was next? Maybe it was me. Maybe my life was a life of being tortured and beat by my father, running away from home at 13, only to find myself in a gang and killed. No, this is not how my life is going to end. So I remember getting out of there, and I went to my aunt's house, and that's where I was staying, and I asked her for help to get back to Virginia. I wanted to go back home with my mom, but by then my dad, I think my dad was gone at this point, but I just knew I couldn't be here anymore. So I moved back to Virginia. But this time when I moved back, it was kind of strange, because none of the neighbors will allow their kids to play with me. I had become an outcast. Imagine that. You're young. I'm a kid. I've only experienced being beat. I've only experienced gangs, people killing each other. And now I don't even have friends. Now I'm an outcast. But I think they did that because I had my left ear pierced and I wore a bandana. And that's kind of what you did when you were in a gang. And of course, me looking the way I looked, parents wouldn't let their kids play with me. So when I couldn't play with kids my age, I turned into something I probably shouldn't have turned into. I
started doing more drugs, started getting high, and that's when I really started running the streets. You see, your environment influences everything about your life. Everything about who you are is determined by the environment in which you're in. So, as a result of missing a father, being beat, running into gangs, I started smoking. I started doing drugs. Started hanging with thugs. Started having sexual relationships that no teenage kid should be having.
Chapter 3: Sex, Drugs, and Thugs. When I got back to Virginia, my mother and father at this point were separated. He had given my mother the house in the area, east side of town of Hampton, Virginia, while he stayed at the same house in which we all grew up in. But when I came home from Pennsylvania, I stayed with my mother. And in her house, she allowed me to convert a room. As a matter of fact, it was the attic of the house that I converted that room to what would end up being somewhat of a drug and sex den. This is where I stayed. My mother, she didn't want any trouble. She had suffered enough, and she didn't ask any questions. She just allowed me to do whatever I wanted, and that room became the hangout. Kids, older kids coming over, having sex, doing drugs. Some of these kids I called family. They were hippies to me. We called each other family. At this time, I was into rock and roll though, you know, so Jimi Hendrix, Purple Haze, a lot of groups were out at this point. We were heavy into LSD, a lot of psychedelic drugs, Mr. Natural. I smoked pot. I did a lot of speed. As a matter of fact, at the end of it all, I had become addicted to speed. They had what they call a pollutant, which was a dietary speed. This is where you would take off the outer coating and you would put it into a spoon and break it down with water. You would draw it with a syringe and shoot it up. And at this time I'm about 128 pounds, but doing a lot of speed and having a lot of group sex. In my room, we had mattresses all on the floor, fishnets hanging all over the wall, black lights. It was pretty much a pot drug hangout for young people. But as sad as it all sounds, we called each other family. And to each other we were family because the only thing we had was the streets. We had each other, but we had each other in the wrong way. The guys, they were older than me. They were a lot older than me. And they would come over, they would get high. And like I said, I was still a kid. I was about 15, 16 years old, and I would watch these guys have sex with our friends. And they took advantage of them. We would get high, have sex with them, and do
whatever we wanted to do with them. It was all about sex. It was all about drugs. They were thugs. And the reason that I say that they were thugs, because I'm 15, 16, and these girls were a lot younger than that. 13, 14. They were in their 20s. They were older. Maybe they should have known better, but I don't think they cared. I don't think anyone cared. I would hear them screaming, "Help, help me, Bogart." They used to call me Bogart. They would be in the other room, and us young men, we couldn't do anything to help them. We just had to do what we had to do. I have a real issue with people that have their way with young girls today. It's just not right. Sex and drugs sounds fun when you're a kid, but when you're older, you look back at the hurt, the pain that you caused these young girls. To this day, it still breaks my heart. I saw a lot of sexual abuse. These girls were being raped. I would see a girl come in with a guy, and she would end up sleeping and having sex with all the guys. They would pretty much set her up. They were coming to get high. It would start as her coming to be with one guy, and then she would get set up. He would invite other men to come and have sex with her. It was awful. These girls were only 13, 14 years old. And it sounds like, well, we were kids, but we were hurt. I was hurt. We hurt a lot of people. Drugs and sex, we hurt a lot of people. And that's when I cried out to the Lord. I cried out to the Lord for help. Chapter 4. Save Me. After going through all the sex, drugs, and thugs at around the age of 17, and had gotten into a lot of trouble, this time, right about 17, I had gotten into even more trouble with narcotic agents. I thought they were coming to party and stuff, and I sold some controlled substance to an undercover agent. When I was busted, they told my mother that they wanted to get me off the streets. They wanted me to either join the military or join the Job Corps. But I didn't want to go into the military, so I said no, and I opted to just do 6 months in the correctional facility. The only thing that saved me was that 6 months. Luckily, I wasn't raped or anything. But being in jail, there were a lot of rapings, all sorts of things. But it never happened to me, thank God. I fortunately just only had 6 months, just enough time to learn that life wasn't for me. When I came out, I did 2 years in the Army, and it was a wild time. I was a young man when I went in. I remember I went to Korea right around that time, but when I came home in 1975, I connected with a friend, an old friend by the name of Randy. Randy was different though when I came back, because Randy had given his life to the Lord. Randy was a white guy, and he was going to a Pentecostal church, Church of God in Christ. He was a, upper middle class white guy from Oregon. He hung around a lot of blacks, and he didn't really know any difference between black and white. He was just a guy who kind of grew up similar to me and didn't really harbor any negative feelings toward anyone, just a really nice guy. But he gave his life to the Lord. And when I got back, I connected with him and I started going to church with him. I wanted to be like Randy. Randy was real. I just remember seeing a young man that had changed his life. He was no longer involved in drugs and crazy sex. He was going to church and living for God. His salvation, his experience was real. When he would come around, we would talk about it. He had found a new life and was committed to the church and to Jesus. And as a matter of fact, I remember just ripping some guys off one time, and I was at this place called the Giant Open Air Market, and I saw the guys I had ripped off, and I was a little scared. As a matter of fact, I was very scared because I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And I started having some flashbacks of being in gangs and the thought of maybe getting potentially hurt really bad or even killed. I saw a payphone and I called Randy and I asked Randy to come and help me. And he said okay. And he eventually came up to get me. And I was in the cafeteria of the market and on the phone, and he said, I'm gonna come and help you, but you're gonna accept Jesus into your life. And I told him, I don't want to hear nothing about Jesus. And he said, if you want me to help you, you know what I'm about, and you're gonna have to ask the Lord for help. So again, we were in the market, and he came through and we had that discussion, and he left and he went out to get his car. But I was still stuck in the market, and like I said, I'd seen the guys that I ripped off, but I didn't want to walk through the market and have them see me, because if they seen me, who knows what they would do. But the only way Randy was going to help me was that I had to find God. I had to find Jesus for myself. And at this point, it didn't really matter what needed to be said or what needed to happen. I just wanted out. So like I said, he said, if you want me to help you, you know what I'm about. You need to ask God for help. He left me. He went and got his car. And I asked him to, hey, go get your car and pull it into the breezeway and pick me up. And he said no. That I needed to walk out. I needed to walk out of that parking lot and get into the car. And it was at that moment that I said to God with tears in my eyes, just let me make it. Just let me make it to the car, and I'll serve you. And I walked through the breezeway and I looked out, and I saw nobody. Nobody was there. And I just walked to the car. And that's when I went to church a couple days later. I went to the church. Matter of fact, it was New Year's. I went to the church New Year's. And that's when I made the decision to give my life to the Lord. I remember sitting at the back of the church and pretty much asked God to help me. I then went to Randy's church, and the bishop was calling for salvation. I got up and I went down and accepted Jesus publicly. Now, this wasn't when I would say I was born again. This was the time that I found out, though, that my girlfriend, Wendy, she was pregnant. She was pregnant with my daughter, Marlene. And she had told me around that time that Marlene would be here in April. So Wendy had already knew she was pregnant, had been pregnant for a few months. But I had just found out that I have a child on the way. Chapter 5. A child is born. I met my girlfriend Wendy at a store called a merry-go-round. Wendy was a Jewish young lady at the time. We were both kids when we first met. But basically, she worked at a merry-go-round, and I just remember a friend of mine wanting to talk to her one time. And I went in and I told her that my friend liked her. I just remember times we would just sit in the store and talk. We would have a good time sitting in the back at the graveyard, smoking some cigarettes. Well, when my friend would come around, I would just step away. And I never will forget, Wendy used to come. Well, she came around one time and used to ask why did I leave or why would I leave. And I used to tell her I thought you were going and wanted to see the other guy, and she simply said no. And that's pretty much how we got together. Wendy was going to the University of Maryland, and I was at the time still in the military. I used to run the roads from Fort Eustis to College Park, back and forth. And I guess you can say somewhere along the line, Wendy got pregnant. And she ended up having my child, Marlene. She ended up having my baby girl. The child that kind of saved my life in a sense. And shortly after I even learned about Marlene is when I had gotten saved. I had given my life to God. Because at this point I had realized that it was more than me to live for. I had a lot to live for now. I had a child on the way. And when I think back, I really do believe this child was a gift from God to me. Well, I remember telling Wendy in order for us to even be together that she needed to also commit her life to the Lord. And with her being Jewish, this just wouldn't work. And I kind of knew it wouldn't work, but that was the criteria that I had set for myself and the criteria that I had set for, at this point, any woman in my life. And after we had Marlene, Wendy was told by her parents that it wasn't a good idea for us to be together, so I ended up taking full custody of Marlene. And at this time, Marlene was a baby. I was about 23 years old, and Wendy moved on. She came back from she came from a background where her parents bribed her to leave. And Wendy chose a home life or a life without Marlene to finish school and ultimately move on with her life. After I had Marlene full time, maybe a year later, Wendy and I ultimately made a decision to no longer see each other, and she went her separate ways, I went mine, and I just wanted the opportunity to live my life for the Lord at this point. I had gone through a lot, and Wendy was a great woman. We were just two different people, but we made something very beautiful of our relationship at the time, and that was Marlene. Wendy had no intention on living for the Lord, and like I said, she was Jewish, so things were going to be different even if we tried. So from that point on, my salvation was the most important thing. We totally separated, and we have never seen each other since. we made that decision that it would be best that we not see each other, and it's really hard to get into this subject because this is not really a negative thing, because I really do thank God for Wendy. I thank God for Wendy for allowing me to have Marlene, because my past was really, it was shaken up. It was shaken up by a lot of things, and it was really at that point that not only did I found God, I found myself. And I was a natural father on top of things. It just came to me so easily. And Wendy never fought me. Wendy felt like it wasn't a good idea for her to keep Marlene, and I felt that it was one that I needed. And it was. It really was a blessing that it happened the way it did, because it truly made me the man that I am today. And like I said, Wendy is a very lovely person. I'm just a little sad that things didn't go the way that, we probably thought they should have. But God had a plan. And I'm just grateful that we both were able to allow God to work His plan. And I can only imagine Wendy, as she looks back through her life, how she probably feels. But God has a plan. And like I said, Wendy's a great person, and I would never say anything bad about her. We were just young, we were kids at the time, but God had an ultimate plan. He had a plan for Wendy, He had a plan for me, and He had a plan for my child, Marlene. Chapter 6: The Call. Marlene and I were doing well, and I was going to church, the Church of God in Christ, but I didn't stay at the church long. I ended up at the Church of God, which was more of a white organization. Randy, who was a white guy, stayed at the Church of God in Christ. That was the black church. It was more of a Pentecostal church. He was going to that church before, way before we got together, or he kind of introduced me to God in a sense. But I didn't stay at the Church of God in Christ long. We were still going. We were still both going strong with both our Christian organizations. When I left the Church of God in Christ, I left because I had a bad experience. I was just a man who had suffered a lot. I was in gangs. I was beat daily by my father, and I was in drugs. I was in a lot of things, and I just wanted away from that life. So I decided to give my life to God, and the church in which I did that was a Church of God in Christ church. But again, I didn't stay there. I ended up going to a Church of God church, which was a white organization. Not that white and black really matters, but in this case, it kind of did. I just remember we were at church, and the bishop stood up when I was giving my testimony about my life, about what God had brought me through, and how He had taken me away from LSD, taken me away from drugs, and from a life of hurt. And the bishop stood up and said to me in front of the church, "Who do you think you are? You're nothing but a 2-bit junkie. I tell you, this hurt me so much. This hurt me so much, and I left the church. After this, I had some of the old saints visit me at my house. But I was hurt because I was searching. I wanted God. And I learned about God through people. And to hear the bishop say that I was nothing but a 2-bit junkie, the only thing it did was resurrect the old me. So I started shooting drugs again. And I went back to the old me. At first the saints would come back and they would try and help me. And I would just tell them no, because I was getting high. And what was kind of funny is that I didn't know if it was an illusion. I didn't know what was happening to me. And I just remember one time I was getting high, and I don't really recall if what I was seeing or if it was an illusion, but it seemed like Jesus came through my wall. And he came into my bedroom in the midst of me getting high. And he looked at me and said, "Did not I say I would be a friend that will stick closer than a brother? Did not I say I would not leave you nor forsake you?" This was the first personal experience that I had with Jesus Christ. And when I heard and I saw that, I just broke down into tears. I pulled the needle out of my arm and I said, "Lord, if you get me out of this, I'll serve you." I remember this like yesterday. It was an experience. You know, some people say, maybe it was because I was high and I wanted God to do that, or what I was searching. I don't know what it was, but that's what I saw, and that's what I heard, and that's what freed me. From that point on, I joined the Madison Avenue Church of God. I walked in while they were having service, and I kneeled down at the altar. And the preacher, he came and he laid his hands on me and said, "I don't know who you are, but God has a quick work for you." I started in that little church, working with the pastor, doing whatever he told me to do. And then he introduced me to the minister of the internship program with the Church of God, and I began to train, study, and work with him. And shortly after that is when I heard the word. It might have been Christ. I heard the word, "He is a new creation. Old things are passed away, and behold, all things are made new." I remember hearing that. I remember hearing that loud and clear. And that was when my life changed, and I began to study. I began to study out of Sector 517, verse 9. God began to change my life from the old to the new. This was all that was holding me back, and the church was always reminding me that I would not amount to anything. It was the church, because of my yesterday and all that I have gone through. It was the church. church that reminded me of my past, but Jesus reminded me of my future. And he told me that I had a new life. I didn't have to be a junkie anymore. I didn't have to settle for drugs. I didn't have to settle for sex. I could be a new man. I could be a new man in Christ. I ended up leaving the military in 1976, and I started to work for the city of Hampton as an inventory clerk for the central garage. I was doing what I was pretty much doing in the military. I was changing the manual stock. I was changing the manual stock card system to the computerized system. And from there is when I started focusing on my ministry. And this is where the new creation started to take shape in my life. And my life began to change. The moment I became a member of the Church of God, I rededicated my life to the Lord. At that time is when I ended up working in the church, and I became the assistant pastor at the Madison Avenue Church of God, and was training to become a minister through their internship program. And through their internship program, I started working at the Faith Church of God, and as a pastor there. And I remember one day me and Marlene were walking down the street, and it's right around Christmas time. And I said to Marlene, "What do you want to be?" And she said, "I want to be a shot lady." She wanted to be a nurse. That's what she remembered. The shot ladies were the nurses. So she said she wanted to be a shot lady, so she wanted to be a nurse so that she could give shots and not get them anymore. And I just thought that was so funny. Later on during the conversation, I asked her, "What do you want for Christmas?" And she kind of sobered up and said, "Dad, I want a mom." And shortly after that is when I met Lolita. And 3 months after that, in 1984, I was married at the Faith Church of God. And I had given Marlene the gift she wanted for Christmas. She wanted a mom. And I was able to give her that gift. And at this time, Marlene was about 6 to 7 years old. And later on, I began to pastor at the Jefferson Avenue Church of God. And this is where I experienced the new creation revelation. I had a vision of a better life. When I moved into a new building, I became a bread of life. The revelation of creation was happening from the time being at the Madison Avenue all the way to the Jefferson Avenue Church of God. I was changing. I was a new man. I was a new creation. I was a new creation through and through. And today I teach about being a new creation. I teach to build, strengthen, and encourage everyday people I come in contact with. This is my heartbeat. I believe that you can walk away from your old life and enter into a new life through Christ. I truly believe anyone can recreate their life in Christ. All they need is a new heart, a heart to allow God into their life. They don't have to struggle. You don't have to struggle through life and the challenges of life, because there is a better way. You can get up from wherever you are and change it. You can start over again. I don't believe in condemnation. I know what it feels like to be told that you're nothing through church. I know what it feels like to go through sex, drugs, gangs, and beatings and torture and hurt, to find God and be told that you're still nothing. So that's not my ministry. My ministry is one of reconciliation, one of hope, one of love. Because through Christ, all things are possible. God gave me a child, Marlene. God gave me a ministry. And today, I've been married for over 30 years to the woman that God sent me through my child, Marlene. And I thank God for my child. Marlene, you saved my life. You were sent from God to save your dad's life. And this is the reason why ministry hasn't been always easy, but just knowing that you've been there, you've been an integral part of my existence. So I thank God for you. I even thank God for my experiences, because my experiences is what made me the man that I am today. I thank God for Randy. I thank God for Wendy. Because without Wendy, I wouldn't have Marlene. Without Randy, I wouldn't have known God. And without my troubled past, I wouldn't have saw a need to change. This is my story, lost and found. I'm Garner Trafton.